Okay, so I guess I'll just try to get straight to the point when telling you about the most terrifying day of my life. I work in a bookstore, and not the cozy, cutesy, small-town vibes kind either. Though God do I wish I did. No, I work in one of those obnoxiously huge, forces small bookstores to close bookstores. Knowing small businesses in the town I grew up in are forced to close their doors for good because of the company I work for setting up shop in town isn't the best feeling in the world, not even close. In fact, it makes me quite sad at times, especially when my mom comes complaining to me that all her friends complain to her about what I'm doing to the community. She's always asking me to quit, or at the very least give back to the community she says I'm stealing from. Funny thing is, I don't run the store, I don't run the company either. I just work in the offices connected to the bookstore and manage mid-level marketing for the company locally and in the surrounding areas. I should also say I still work for the same company, even after what happened. It wasn't really their fault after all. Alright, so there was this random Thursday afternoon in October, my favorite month to work by the way. There was an incredible view of Main Street from my desk on the 3rd floor. The city had gone all out with decorations for Halloween. On every street sign and the lamppost, there were fake spider webs and fall-colored leaves clinging on and swinging in the wind. The trees were all changing color, and I couldn't help but stare at the world outside my office. The world I wish I spent more time in, instead of stuck behind a desk. This day, however, when I found myself looking out the window, I saw something I really wished I had not. The bank across the street was a local one. Not one of those big branch banks scattered around every city in the country. It was always very quiet, and my mom actually worked there. She liked to wave at me through the front window every day at noon exactly. While she was having her lunch, I always found it a very sweet gesture. Only this day at noon, when I'd gone to the window to give my mom a little wave and a smile, she wasn't there. Actually, no one was. Usually there'd be people walking in and out of the bank at this time of day, but there was no one there, and that's when I saw him. A man in a mask, holding a gun at his side, peering out the window as though he was looking for someone. That's when panic mode set in. I rushed to the phone on my desk and dialed 911 while trying to keep my eyes on the man inside that building, with my mom and who knows how many other people inside. My heart was racing so fast I could barely speak. When the dispatcher answered, it felt like it took everything in me to force the words out, to describe what was happening before my eyes. She started to ask me a bunch of questions I couldn't possibly have the answer to, considering the only thing I could see was just barely inside the front doors. I made sure to inform them as much as I could though. The man inside was armed and I had no idea if he had any partners. I guess that's all they needed from me though, since they insisted I didn't need to stay on the phone with them. In my haste to explain the situation though, I hadn't realized the masked man was no longer looking out the window down the street anymore. Now he was facing directly toward me. I slammed the phone onto the receiver and closed the blinds as fast as I could. I couldn't help myself though. I had to take a peek and see if he was still looking toward my window. I slid my fingers through the cracks in the blinds and bent them down slightly. It was just small enough a gap to peer through, and to my relief and somewhat surprise, it didn't seem he was looking toward me anymore. Actually, I couldn't see him at all. He wasn't standing at the front of the bank anymore. I felt this sense of relief fill me for just a second, and then fear came creeping in again. I realized not being able to see him meant I didn't know what he was doing anymore, and not knowing was the worst. He could be in there hurting someone, and there would be nothing I could do. In that moment of panic, not knowing if my mother was okay, my phone started ringing. It was her. I picked up the phone and answered immediately, asking if she was okay. She was crying and scared. She said she was okay, and so was everyone else, and that's when she told me something that gave me the chills. She said something had spooked the man real bad. He'd walked right out the doors across the street, and into my building. She told me I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. Without even thinking, I walked calmly toward my office door and down the row of desks. I told everyone along the way they needed to exit the building as well. Just as I reached the stairwell, I heard gunshots from behind me. About eye level on the wall next to the door was the fire alarm. I slammed my hand down on it, and I couldn't help but cringe when the loud alarm began to blare overhead. That's when I felt a hand grasp my forearm from behind and pull me backward. "You shouldn't have done that!" The man's voice sounded very raspy. I turned to face him, knowing I had a better chance of fighting him off if we were face to face. I could somewhat predict what he was going to do next. "Everyone down on the ground now! I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will if I have to, got it?" He looked around after he said that, like someone would have the guts to actually answer this man. He was still holding on to me at that point, and it was starting to hurt. I just stared at the guy. I had no idea what he planned, or why he'd come here in the first place. I, nor anyone in the building, had interest in questioning him. "Alright, since you're the one who set off the fire alarm, you're gonna be the one to turn it off." He looked more annoyed than anything when he said that. My voice was shaky, and I finally worked up the courage to answer him. "I don't know how to turn it off. That's something the fire department does." He rolled his eyes and shoved me into a chair. "Then you're gonna call the fire department and tell them everything is alright here and it was just a stupid misunderstanding, and you're gonna do it without complaining. Otherwise, I'm gonna shoot one of these very nice people here, okay?" He sat down next to me and let me use the computer to look up the phone number to the local fire department. When I finally reached them on the phone and repeated what the guy wanted me to say, they told me they were aware of the situation already. Thankfully, it was not on speaker, so when he asked me what they said, I was able to lie to him. A few minutes later, the alarm turned off, and the masked man continued his tirade about how life was not fair and God hated him, how his dad left when he was a kid, and that to him, making bad decisions while he was growing up was just what led him here. This man was telling us his whole life story, almost like he was trying to justify what he was doing. I was toward the back office, so I couldn't tell when the police would get there. I just knew that they had arrived from the look on his face though, and the sweat now pooling on his shirt. That's when the phone calls started coming in. Hostage negotiator, I'm assuming. Every time they'd call, the man would get angrier and angrier and demand the most outrageous things. At first, he wanted a car to drive away and for no one to follow. Classic demand. That escalated to him begging whoever was on the other end of the phone for a helicopter to land on the roof of the building and fly him away. A fake passport, $10 billion in cash. I was scared, but something was also telling me this was winding down. If he was going to hurt someone, he would have already done so. Eventually, he started letting a few of us go at the time. I was among the last 3 still trapped inside with him. It had been hours, and I was exhausted mentally and physically. Just done. The phone calls became less frequent. He became even more antsy, just so genuinely desperate for a way to get out of there that didn't involve jail time. To be totally honest with you, some strange part of me actually started to feel bad for the guy. As he continued to explain his rough, unfortunate life, I couldn't help but wonder how things could have ended up differently. After some time, he finally let the rest of us go out of the building. My mother was standing there waiting for me. I ran into her arms so fast. Only minutes after exiting the front doors, a loud gunshot was heard coming from the building. The police all rushed in. Turns out he decided ending his life was a better option than going to prison for his crimes. He chose my office to do so, which only made me feel that much worse. I watched as they brought him out in a body bag and loaded him into the city's coroner's van. I found myself standing there, watching as the van drove away and the police cleared the scene. The man had no funeral. No one cared about his passing, considering there wasn't even an obituary written for him. Just his death announced in the local paper, tied into the article about what happened that day. I requested to switch offices, of course, and to this day the view outside the window just doesn't look the same. Some part of it now felt tainted, like the happiness I once saw in the world was clouded by the harsh reality I hadn't realized before. that one person isn't always the only one to blame for the sad or dark outcome of their life. All I can say in the end is that I hope in death he finally found the peace he was so desperately searching for in life. I guess the only reason I'm even telling this story is to somehow try and move past the things that happened that day and the trauma and scars it left on me. My therapist says to move on. I have to talk about it, and I don't want to talk to anyone I actually know. Here I am telling strangers on the internet about the worst day of my life. I live in what some people would call a third world country. I'm from the United States originally, but I moved to this place when I was relocated for work. Honestly, I figured it wouldn't be that bad considering I was a man and men are usually treated well in that country. I don't want to name exactly where this was because I don't want things to turn political or for people to make assumptions about what happened just based on the place. Part of me is also worried that if I tell you where this happened, you'd find an article about it online and find out who I am. Maybe that's just the paranoia though. Anyway, a little bit about me. I'm currently 32 years old, but when this happened, I was in my late 20s. I was somewhat overweight and didn't get out very much, so when my job needed someone to relocate to another country, I volunteered. I figured it would be the push I needed to try new things and go new places. I had to take 5 flights just to get there, and by the time the last flight landed, I was completely exhausted and not at all excited about starting work in a whole new place. I had a few days to settle into my new apartment before my first day at the office about 30 minutes away. What I do isn't exactly super interesting. Lots of paperwork and phone calls really. A part of me didn't even understand why they actually needed me to be there. Everything I was doing was something that could be done back home. But I was already there now and I had a contract for 1 year, so I had to stick it out whether I liked it or not. Got to the apartment and was immediately disappointed. It looked nothing like the pictures that had been posted online. In fact, it was a whole different layout. When I tried to complain to the building manager, he just stared at me until I realized he couldn't even understand what I was saying. I made my way back up to my cockroach-infested apartment and had no hope for the next year. I immediately regretted my decision to come here, but unfortunately there was no going back now. My first day went okay actually. No one cared I was there, and for the most part everyone left me alone. My boss barely spoke any English, so we said as much as we could to each other in terms of introductions before I went and sat down at my dusty old desk. It seemed this was going to be the whole next year of my life. The first week was alright. I noticed a few of my coworkers staring at me and whispering things to each other while they did. I honestly didn't care at all though, considering I had no idea what they were saying anyway. I like keeping to myself. It made the time pass by faster when I zoned out everything else. I even bought myself a pair of noise-canceling headphones to make it even quieter. Next month, I got a notice not to come in for a few days since they were remodeling. I happily stayed home, and thank God for the time off. It was much needed. By the time I went back to work, they had added all new cubicles and lots of furnishing as well. It was much nicer. Honestly, it made me want to stay at work longer, to escape all the bugs in my apartment building. I found myself soon working 12-hour days. At first, I would have thought this would be an issue for the company, considering 4 of those hours were overtime. But it didn't seem to be a problem. I was actually getting so much work done, I got an email from corporate congratulating me on how fast I was helping the branch catch up with their late work. By month 3, I had the whole routine down. I woke up at 6 a.m. every morning, made myself breakfast, checked the news. Then 7:30 I began my walk to work, and by 8 I was there. Usually I was the first person there as well. I would put on my noise-canceling headphones and get right to work. Some days I wouldn't take them off at all. This was one of those days. I got to work at 8 a.m. as usual. Everything seemed very normal. I sat down at my desk, plopped in my trusty noise-canceling headphones, and got right to work. I loved sitting in those cubicles because they secluded me so much more than regular desks. Even in the little doorway to the cubicle, I added a curtain to block myself off more. It was like my own little room where no one ever disturbed me. It was great. I got to work, and for the next few hours, everything went smoothly. I kept my head down, did my work as usual. Everything was like every other day. At around 1 p.m. though, I felt a vibration underneath my feet of a lot of footsteps walking quickly out of the office. It even felt like some people might be running, but it was lunchtime and I naively chalked it up to people heading out to lunch. I never even lifted my head to see what was going on. By 1:15, the power had suddenly gone out. The whole floor was dark, with only bits of sunlight peering in between the blinds on the windows. I removed my headphones and stood up, and that's when I realized I was the only person still in the office. I walked to our manager's doorway, but he was also nowhere to be found, and that's when I noticed the smoke. It had gone from completely clear air in the room to smoke so thick I could barely see 5 feet in front of me in the span of only 10 minutes. It was seeping from the ground below me. I started to cough so hard, it felt like my lungs were going to burst out of my chest. I started to make my way to the stairwell, but with every step it felt like my body was getting heavier and heavier. At some point I ripped off my shirt, balled it up and shoved it against my mouth and nose to try and filter the air. I knew my lungs had already absorbed a lot of smoke, but I had to do something. The ground underneath me was hot, burning hot. My shoes were almost melting, and the bottoms of my feet were being branded like white-hot metal. It was excruciating. I had about 50 feet between me and the stairwell door, but to me in this situation, it felt like 500 feet. At that point, the walls around me even started to catch fire. The flames were so hot that even when I was standing 20 feet away from them, they were burning my skin. I was terrified. It was like I was a kid again. All I wanted was my dad to come and save me from this horrible situation. I started to pray, praying every second that I was in the building. Every second I felt my skin burning away. Please God, let me survive this. Give me the strength to escape this building. Every step I took was like walking on lava. I was determined to live though. The building around me even started to fall apart as I was now surrounded by flames. At 1:35 p.m., I made it to the stairwell door. I placed my hand on the door handle, and the searing pain of the metal touching my skin had me pulling my hand back so fast, I hit myself in the chest. I had to think quickly. I lowered my shirt from my mouth and wrapped it around my hand. I knew the handle would still be hot, but any barrier was better than none. I braced myself for the pain I was about to experience, and again set my hand on the knob and pulled it open quickly. It hurt, but at this point, I think my body was going into shock. I felt my legs burning, and when I looked down, I saw my pants had burned away entirely from my body. My legs were now exposed to the flames and heat that had started to engulf me. I knew I had to make a decision. I had to go as fast as I could down those stairs, no matter how painful it would be, or I would die. I took as deep a breath as I could and began jumping down the stairs. I skipped as many as I could in hopes it would get me down faster. I screamed in pain with each step, but eventually I found myself on the bottom floor, in front of the door that would lead me to salvation. The stairwell had begun to fall apart above me, pieces of metal and wood raining down as I pushed against the door. Once outside, I was greeted by firemen yelling in my face in a language I didn't understand. The shock must have worn off, because then everything went black. The next thing I remember, I was in the hospital. The doctor told me that 70% of my body had been seriously burned, but I would likely survive. The pain even in the hospital was excruciating. I called my mom and dad, who were already arranging for me to be transported home for better medical care. I was in the hospital in that foreign country for 2 months before I was stable enough to be moved. The worst part was the debridement, which is where they remove dead tissue from your wounds. They were literally taking off chunks of skin to ensure I didn't get an infection. I knew it was part of the treatment process, but it felt like literal torture. For the longest time, I blamed my coworkers. I felt like they'd left me there to die. In reality, because I was so isolated, my boss told me they didn't even know I was still there. I'd made no sound throughout the whole day, and because I always arrived at work 30 minutes early, no one had actually seen me come in. My resentment toward them eventually went away, and I realized it was not their fault. As it turned out, a car had caught on fire parked in the alleyway next to the building. Because the building was so old, it was made of cheap materials, and they'd caught fire easily as well. There was no stopping it. Apparently, my boss thought that everyone had gotten out. I guess no one had thought to get a total head count. Apparently, when I'd come out of the building, everyone was shocked and terrified to see I'd been in there the entire time. Recovery has been one of the hardest things I've ever gone through, but I'm grateful I escaped with my life. One thing I've learned from all of this is that it really doesn't pay to be a totally isolated loner. Make sure someone knows where you are at all times. I live in a big city. It's not where I pictured living, but finding a job in a small town like the one I grew up in just was not working out. I'd gone to community college a few towns over, since it was the only higher education school within a 50-mile radius. There were not exactly many options. Pretty much no options, actually. I didn't consider moving for school, since I had no money and my parents had only offered to pay for my schooling if I stayed home while attending. They were the extremely controlling type. They even still tried to give me a curfew when I was 20 years old. I put a stop to that mentality pretty quick though. Maybe it was the fact that I'm their only child, but I had to let them know that as an adult, they couldn't tell me everything to do anymore. It was quite hard for them to accept at first, but they learned to respect my boundaries, and I learned that compromise in a situation is sometimes better than arguing. Eventually, I graduated with an associate degree in journalism. I was extremely excited. I knew I didn't want to do anything in the political field. Those journalists are hated so much. I wanted to write about something a little more lighthearted and fun. I wanted to work for a magazine, maybe fashion or something like home decor. It seemed more fun than business or finance or politics, where everything is so deadly serious all the time. The only problem was there were no writing jobs in my area. The only options job-wise were the local grocery store that people started working at when they were teenagers and never left, or the gas station where all the junkies hang out all the time. Neither of those sounded like appealing options exactly. I didn't want to be one of those people that commute 3 hours to work a day either. Since the city was the only real place that had options, I decided I'd move finally. At first, I didn't know where. I'd considered Los Angeles, but all the writing jobs down there were about celebrities. You know, OMG, he went where with her? Such meaningless drivel in my opinion. I thought about Seattle, but then I remembered the awful weather they have up there. Rains all the time. No thanks. That's when I settled on New York City. I found a couple of places that were hiring for writing positions. I was absolutely interested in all of them, and I applied to them all as well. Of course, I was hoping that even one would take me at that moment. I wanted it more than anything in the world. I'd already found a room to rent in an apartment with 3 other girls for a reasonable price, by New York City standards. Everything in me was telling me this was going to be a good thing, but man was I wrong. I don't know if bigger cities just have more creeps or if they're all just really bold, but sheesh, I hated all the unnecessary attention I was constantly getting literally everywhere I went. Even just walking up the street or up the stairs to my apartment, I'd be harassed everywhere. It was uncomfortable and really started to get to me. My roommates all told me it was normal, and if I wanted to live in the city, I'd have to learn to get used to this. That just made me even more angry about it all, that it was something so normal to be experienced there, something to just be brushed off and forgotten about the second it happened. It's not like there was anything I could do about it though. I was too scared to say anything back to those people. I guess I did eventually get used to it, and I learned to ignore it as well. I'd gotten a job for a pretty well-known magazine. I wasn't exactly writing any star articles, but I was excited to be there nonetheless. I got a paid internship. I didn't make much, but the experience and opportunity to learn was worth it. Unfortunately, the harassment didn't stop when I entered the workplace. It was actually somewhat worse. The men in the top positions in the building felt emboldened by their status and obviously knew no one would do anything to them when they did something anyone else would consider wrong. I found myself in an awful position, in a place where anyone I told would just tell me to keep my mouth shut about it all, and that the stuff I was saying wasn't something anyone talked about. There was this one day, after I'd been working with the company for about 6 months, when I was called into one of the higher-ups' offices. I knocked before entering and was told to come in. I noticed right away he was an older man, probably in his 60s. He sat at a large desk in front of a huge window with the most beautiful view overlooking the city. He must have seen me staring because he offered to let me stand by him to get a better look. I thought it was a nice gesture. I made my way next to him and stood admiring the city I now called home. He was sitting directly next to me and had turned his chair to join me in looking out the window. That's when I felt it, his hand traveling up my thigh and making its way up the rest of my butt. I don't even know the words to express my feelings in that moment. It was a mixture of a bunch of emotions. I was angry at the fact he felt he could touch me, scared I was alone in the room with this man, and shamed that it had been about 30 seconds and I still hadn't swatted his hand away. I was scared of what would happen when I did. I couldn't let it go on any longer though. I pushed away from him and asked him what he was doing. He pretended not to know what I was referring to, and like I had made the whole thing up. After arguing with him for a couple of minutes, I decided going to HR was my best option. I made my way to the elevator and pressed the floor I was going to. The second the doors closed, I burst out crying. The elevator dinged and signaled it was my stop. I got out and made my way to the office, where an older woman was sitting behind the desk. I told her there was something I wanted to report, and she very bluntly told me that if it had anything to do with the guy who had just touched me, there was no point, and I should get back to work. I was confused how she knew that's what I was there for, but eventually I understood. I wasn't the only person he'd done this to. I wasn't the only person who'd come to HR to try and report him either. I was always told that whenever something like this happens, to tell someone about it to get help if I needed it. There I was trying to do exactly that, and the person who was supposed to help me was adamant to drop it. The next day, I was called into his office again. I was only an intern, and whenever the other male interns were called in, he would only ask for coffee or for them to run some paperwork. When he asked for me, I would always ask one of the guys to go for me. I was scared of that man and what he might do if I stepped into his office again. Later that day, I got an email from him. It said something like, "The next time I ask for you, it better be you who comes. Don't forget, I can end your career in the city before you can even blink." It was intimidating. Of course it was intimidating. There I was, a 21-year-old girl, faced with a man telling me he was going to ruin my career if I didn't do what he asked. The next day, obviously he asked for me again. I entered his office and stayed right by his door, so I couldn't give him away to get close to me, and I had a quick exit if needed. He began telling me about articles the magazine had published the day before. He sounded weird though. The way he talked wasn't his usual manner of speaking. He began to stutter and his body was shaking. I only realized what he'd been doing when he let out a loud moan and rolled his head back. Yeah, he was doing exactly what you think. I yelled at him that he was disgusting and ran out as fast as I could. Honestly, I didn't care about that internship at that point. I didn't care about anything that man had to say about me around the city. I could find another job somewhere else if I had to move. I didn't care, but I wouldn't let him get away with what he was doing. I went to the police and they told me that without proof there wasn't anything they could do. I filed a report anyways. I went back to the apartment and told my roommates what happened. Of course, they were as creeped out and disgusted as me, but shockingly told me to keep the internship. They said the job was so good that having to put up with one pervy man was worth it. I tried complaining to HR again, this time insistent I be moved to a different floor. I was willing to try to find a new job, but I kind of needed this one to pay rent while I looked for a different one. I was moved a few floors down, and for the next couple of weeks after that, I had no issues. That's when the emails started coming in. They were always from a new anonymous email address, and every single one always contained a nude photo, always from the same person. Unfortunately, I could tell. I informed the police, who again told me there was nothing they could do. I started hating everything about that city. I hated how everyone told me this was normal and I should put up with it. I wanted someone to listen to me and agree that what I was going through was not okay. I knew who was sending me those photos, and I couldn't take it anymore. I sent an email to everyone in the office detailing what had happened to me. I explained everything I went to and how many times I'd tried to report it to HR, and they did nothing to help me. Then I quit. For the next few days, I got emails from other women in the office telling me they had experienced the same or similar things with the man who had touched me. I was mad that no one would do anything about it, but at least everyone knew now. I never went back, so I never saw the fallout from my email myself. I hope he got what he deserved, although I know he probably didn't. I found a job at a different company that I adore working at. I'm treated great and can gladly say I've not experienced anything like that since. To any woman out there who's going through or has gone through something similar, and they feel like there's no one out there who understands or who listens, just know you're not alone.